started off with me attempting to find a solution to cover up the metal of the paperclip additions that I'm adding onto the trousers of look number 3 and the dress of look number 6. So I made two first paperclip options. One is huge, one's a bit smaller. I thought that I would try and cover the smaller one with leather strips. This is an offcut from an old sofa that the workers here in the atelier disassembled and left to me. So I thought I was genius, cut out two pieces and decided to connect them all together, and it was working out just fine before I tried to iron it. And because this is synthetic leather, I was ironing it through a piece of fabric so that it wouldn't burn. But the problem is that it creases and starts breaking on the edge, so this method is definitely not going to be working for me. Another option that was suggested is that I try to cut it on bias and just kind of sew it similarly, because this synthetic leather also has a bit more stretch on the angle, but I'm not sure. It's going to have a bunch of seams, and so the edges that are going to be covering the paperclip with seams are going to be very bulky, so I still don't know what I'm going to do with this. So I thought I'd test out just encasing this piece of paperclip into leather, but it didn't really work because the stitches are super wonky, which I'm not sure you can see. But then I decided to just play around with it on the body, just like I do with all the samples. So I like this little experiment, and I decided to recreate it in fabric that will go a bit better with the color palette of my degree collection. And luckily, the atelier had disassembled some old couch again, so I was able to use that faux leather offcuts and line it with synthetic fabric, so that in the end of its life cycle, the stock could be recycled. It looks a bit more three-dimensional, which I don't mind at all because of the lining. And I also love this little boob area because the semicircles of the paperclip are lining the breast pretty perfectly, and if I were to style on a model, I would put her in a top from look number 1 or look number 3 because it's a little transparent and you can see the nipple peeking through, and I feel like if it were to peek through right between those two semicircles of a paperclip that are visible, it would be perfect. In a previous vlog, you saw me make some changes to my range plan, and I added a completely different look where my look number 4 used to be, and this one was a jersey look with leggings and a top, which I tested out. And I came back to the outlet fabric store to get some deadstock jersey. I got this dark blue inky jersey and started cutting it out because I already had tested this out. My pattern was pretty perfect, and I also created tiny little patterns to mark out where the stitching would go, so that should have been very smooth. Apart from one thing, I'm using a flat felt sewing machine, which is never easy to use. It's always bitching with me. It's always really difficult to work. Even when I have adjusted everything, something goes wrong all the time. So I tried to stitch this first side seam with a flat felt sewing machine, and it keeps skipping stitches. This is happening perhaps because maybe the tension on this middle thread is way too high and it just keeps pulling without allowing the top thread to kind of catch it. So maybe I should adjust it, but like it fits so well, it lies pretty straight, I don't see any looping happening, so I would really try to not adjust it any more than it should. But like obviously I want to avoid areas like these. And also the reason why I had to stop right now is because this middle thread just ripped on me, and I do know why that happened. Is because the number of that thread is 140 and they are quite thin, so it's pretty easy to rip it apart. So I have to find a similar thread in here in the atelier, which should be easy, but like look, I just ripped it with one hand. So there are a bunch of different options, none of which are perfect, so I'm going to try to find something similar to these, but look, they're pretty much exactly the same. These two are 120 and this is 140, which the bigger the number is, the thinner the thread is. Usually on the needle threads you would use a size 100, which is thicker because it's a bit more sturdy, and especially because I'm trying to sew this as a decorative stitch, it should not see too much pulling, but obviously because it's not really connecting anything together, it's just going to be mostly one layer of fabric, it should be strong. So I'm going to have to find a substitute for this middle one because it's way too thin to hold everything together. That's skipping again, and again. So I thought in the beginning, like, well, if it skips this only stitch, I would be able to kind of hand fix it back into place. But then once those started happening, I was like, well, I might as well just finish and see how many of those I get. Seems to be working. I switched up all of the needles and it turned out that the middle one was a bit shorter than all the other ones, and the left one was also too thick or something like, so I switched all of them, took all from a new pack, and they seem to be working. This is like the longest streak without any skipping stitches that I had, and here I just pulled a few out, so I'm hoping that now it's gonna work. Okay, so this is a huge improvement from what I had over here. Every once in a while I was skipping stitches, and now it's going pretty well, apart from that one area that I decided to skip a stitch as well near the ending, but I'll be able to fix it by hand, which I'm going to be doing right now. Also, to that one person who is trying to work around with this machine who's also struggling, I had a bunch of overlap in this area when I just started from the edge, because the machine didn't really want to go over and start from that edge, so I started on a little piece and I pulled on it when I went to this area. So when you're pulling, you're creating tension, and then it goes pretty smoothly. And no matter how much I want to claim that I'm friends with flatbed sewing machine, we are probably just frenemies. I've adjusted this thing a little bit, so I think I've showed you that I removed the front flap and I had to add a bunch of bias binding to all the edges that I didn't exactly like, so that it would look a little bit cleaner, a little bit neater. I left some fraying deliberately because I wanted to kind of tie it in together with some different pieces of the collection that were loose and thready. And then I also finished the bottom line a bit differently, so I added the metal wire in there so that it would hold its shape when you walk, because otherwise it was kind of bunching up and looking a bit weird. So I was able to unravel the hemline and add like maybe 3 centimeters in total to the edge. And this is my first attempt at making a full-on bra with hooks and everything. I actually thought of making a wire bra, but then I just changed my mind because this is some sort of a side project for my degree collection, and I would rather finish the degree collection before going on to something else. So my biggest mistake was using lace that isn't stretchy, and for this top I basically just copied one that I already had, and the lace that I got was essentially meant for like dresses and skirts, so obviously it doesn't stretch just a tiny bit, and it doesn't really affect the fit that much because there is an opening on the back, but in the initial bra there was no opening, so I kind of had to maneuver and add it in here. It wasn't that difficult because I just bought a strip of those hooks and eyes and it works pretty well, I find, but it could have been avoided. Again, if the fabric was stretchy, it would be easier to avoid the puckering like this. Also, again, because of the stretch of the lace, I had to drop the line of the thong quite low. It looks pretty interesting on the body, but it should have been over here if I were to copy the exact underwear I was copying. And I had to add the side pieces as well because otherwise it was pretty much impossible to put it on a mannequin. So other than that, it's fine for the first attempt at making underwear, but it gave me a lot of inspiration to actually start introducing pieces like it to my degree collection, because initially that was exactly what I was planning on doing. So I tried my hand at making a full-on bra underwear set, and now I'm introducing something similar to my degree collection, so let's get on to that. In my previous vlog, which was a month ago, you saw me finish this organza dress where I introduced a very gentle, very soft underwear elastic into the mix and play around with different zigzags, and I knew that I was gonna have a bunch of that organza left over because initially I was planning on doing multiple layers of it, but then I started, even before that, experimenting and sketching different thoughts and ideas of making an organza slip dress. It could have been look number 7, look number 8, whatever, because I'm exceeding the amount of looks that I have for the degree collection at this point. So I was playing around with different tensions of zigzag as well to create vertical and horizontal lines. I wanted to introduce the idea of body pat downs and airports back into the collection because I was exploring it in semester A or in the beginning of semester B, and I have a tour of my sketchbook where you can see me explore this idea. But essentially I had created a guideline of how the pat downs are performed in the airport, and I created that with pleating, but in here I just wanted to kind of mimic the direction of pleating with this little zigzag tension, and I was thinking of making this slip dress. But because I started exploring underwear and started playing around with it, I decided to maybe introduce it in a little bit of a different way, because this lineup kind of wants something short, something very minimally covering the body, and if I were to create a slip dress, it would have just been short and you would have seen legs, but it would still cover up the body pretty well. So I wanted to create something extremely minimal, very tiny for the body, and I sketched out a few underwear ideas. So it's essentially a stripped down version of that slip dress, but just more minimal. So I decided to bring back the idea of crumpling, but this time use it in organza. I used a similar method in the trousers that you saw me make quite a while ago again. So like I mentioned, I had a bunch of leftover organza as well as a toile from look number 5 and a layer that I didn't use in the end. So I decided to cut it up instead of throwing it away or just reusing it in a later project. I started cutting up into layers of bias binding, and that took so much time just because you kind of have to be very careful when you want to make your bias, since you want to keep it at 32 millimeters, no less, no more, when it comes to making like the standard bias binding. So I had to cut it very carefully when it neatly, and then also iron a shit ton of it because I cut up a whole dress. I started ironing it, and luckily I found some random video on Instagram, which was probably from TikTok. Essentially what you do is just pin your bias binding when you fold 2 of the edges. You iron it a little bit and then pin it as close to the bias binding as possible, so that later when you pull it through, all the other edges start kind of folding on themselves without any help from you. That was very lucky that I found this video a couple of days right before I had to make this bias, because it made my job a lot easier. And when I was sewing it, the bias worked perfectly, so I can't really say that I was exactly perfect and super neat with this one, because this top was an experiment, but I still like how it turned out. The middle section here you see actually has a wire inside, and it's not that evident, but it's actually quite ugly because it's grey and the organza bias is transparent, so you can see it. I decided to remove it, and also this curvature didn't really look good on the body, and I had to make it straight across. I know it doesn't look that great on a mannequin, but on the body, trust me, it looks a lot better. This is not my neatest job, but I still quite like it. The outcome is pretty. Just like my group mate Tatiana, I think I have fallen in love with tiny pretty things like these. They're quite simple and everyone has seen them under bras, but for some reason they just bring me joy when I introduce them into my collection, and now I've used them I think 3 times already, so you will probably see me explore those in my next collections as well. I'm going to try to be a bit better with filming because this month I was just a little bit more scattered and not filming that much.